Good morning, Wareham. Alright, so we're doing chapter 12, the Firebrands. And really it's about three people who started people going to start this revolution thing. So it's Sam Adams, who you've heard about, I'm sure, Thomas Paine, and Patrick Henry, the famous speaker. All right, so let's learn about the Firebrands, the three guys who kind of really started the revolution. Okay, let's see it. Can you guess what a firebrand is? Firebrands were very useful when people didn't have matches and the only heat in the house came from the fireplace. You've probably figured it out. A firebrand is a stick of wood with a spark of fire at one end. In other words, to start a fire. Now, if you look in the dictionary, you'll see another meaning for firebrand. A firebrand can be a hothead, someone who sparks revolution, someone who lights a fire in people's minds and hearts. Historians say the American Revolution had three firebrands: Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Paine. That War of Independence might have happened without them, but it certainly would have been different. Patrick Henry was a great speaker. Tom Paine was a great writer. Samuel Adams could write well and think well, but what Adams really was a super busybody. He got everyone keyed up, inspired, and moving. Sam Adams was a New Englander from Boston with a Puritan background. Tom Paine came from England and lived in the Middle Colonies in Philadelphia. He was a deist with Quaker friends. Patrick Henry was a Southerner, an Anglican, a Virginian, and a country boy. These men were very different from one another, but alike in one important way. Each understood before most other Americans did that a break from England was necessary. I've told you before that it took a long time for the colonists to think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as English colonists. Even those who came from France or Germany or Holland soon thought of English rights as their rights. When they stopped seeing themselves as English, they began to say they were Virginians or New Englanders or Carolinians. It was hard for them to understand they could all be part of the same country. To begin with, they didn't know each other. That was because overland travel between colonies was very difficult. There were no good roads and few bridges. On the fastest stagecoach, you could make 8 miles an hour, as long as there were no ruts in the road or mud or ice. For poor people, travel meant going on foot. But if you were like most travelers, you rode horseback. If you needed to cross a river, you usually had to find a boat. Your horses had to swim the river. If you had a lot of baggage, it might take many trips to get it all across. If the river current was swift, you could lose everything, even your life. By 1760, with good winds and good luck, you could sail from Baltimore to London in 4 weeks. So, wealthy Marylanders were more likely to go to England than to Massachusetts. And the same was true of the Virginians and the South Carolinians. London still seemed the most exciting city in the world. Now, can you see why most people in the different colonies were strangers to each other? Well, the Firebrands helped change that. Sam Adams started something called Committees of Correspondence. They were groups of prominent citizens who wrote back and forth between colonies and helped each other with problems. They began to be friends. Adams started other groups, such as the Sons of Liberty. In Boston, the Sons met under an old elm tree that Adams called the Liberty Tree. As soon as the British got a chance, they chopped that tree down. A Liberty Tree still stands in Annapolis, Maryland. But mostly what Sam Adams started was trouble for the British. He was a rabble-rouser and an agitator, a real firebrand, who helped brew up the Boston Tea Party and fight against the Stamp Act. But you never would have known it that to look at him. Sam Adams was a Humpty-Dumpty looking man, rumpled and pudgy. He came from a prominent Boston family, but he lost almost all the family money because he didn't care about business. Some people said that he was lazy, but he wasn't lazy when it came to fighting for freedom. The English called Adams a public enemy, an outlaw, a rebel. They wanted to hang him. He certainly was a troublemaker, but Sam Adams was different from other rebels in other times. He wanted more than just separation from England. He was inspired by a grander idea, the idea that America could be a special nation where people would be free of kings and princes, a nation where for the first time in all of history, people would truly rule themselves. His Puritan ancestors had described their colony as an experiment. They hoped it would be a close to perfect society. They called it a city on a hill, and they meant that others should see it, and that it would be an example to the whole world. But the Puritan dream was only for Puritans. Sam Adams had a great dream that was for all people. So did Tom Paine. Now, Sam Adams was a Harvard man who had old roots in the young country. Tom Paine was hardly off the boat from England. In 1774, when he became a firebrand of revolution, he didn't plan it that way. "I thought it very hard," he wrote, "to have the country set on fire, almost the moment I got into it." He had been apprenticed to a corset maker when he was a boy in England. Corsets are tight undergarments that women wore to hold in their stomachs and make their waists look tiny. Being a corset maker was not exactly an exciting career, not for a boy with a mind like Tom's. So he ran away and went to sea. But that didn't work out. Then he tried to be a grocer, and a school teacher, and a tobacco seller. Nothing worked, except his fine mind, and that kept him learning. He went to lectures and he read everything he could find to read. When he met Ben Franklin in London, he knew he wanted to go to America. He almost didn't make it. He caught a fever on board ship and was carried ashore half dead. But he was young and strong and he survived. Franklin had given him a letter that got him a job as a writer and magazine editor in Philadelphia. That was the perfect use for his talents, for he was a magician with words. By the 1770s, the colonists were beginning to want to separate from England. But they weren't quite sure why, and they wondered if it was right to do so. Tom Paine was able to say clearly what people really knew in their hearts. He wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. In it, he told the colonists 3 important things. Monarchy was a poor form of government, and they would be better off without it. Great Britain was hurting their economy with taxes and trade restrictions. It was foolish for a small island 3,000 miles away to try to rule a whole continent. Well, of course, all that made common sense. But Tom Paine said it so eloquently that a whole lot of copies of Common Sense were sold in a very short time. When the Revolution began, Paine enlisted in the Continental Army. Then he wrote a series of pamphlets about the war. He started one of them with these words: "These are the times that try men's souls." Stop and read that line again. "These are the times that try men's souls." Whew, what do you think of that as a way to start a book about war? Tom Paine made people stop and think. He was a man of deep beliefs. He believed in the American cause. He was not rich, but he gave 1/3 of his salary to help Washington's army, and he never took any money for his patriotic writings. He said that would demean them. "We have it in our power to begin the world again," wrote Paine, and he really meant it. Patrick Henry was the third Firebrand, and like Adams and Payne, he was a failure at first. He was born on a Virginia frontier farm. His father came from Scotland and had been to college there. He taught his son to read both English and Latin. They read the Bible aloud together, and Patrick learned to love the sounds of the English language. He used English as no American speaker had done before him. He was called a forest-born Demosthenes. That was a compliment, because Demosthenes was a great orator and a fighter for freedom in ancient Greece. But Patrick Henry started out as a storekeeper, and then tried being a planter, and failed at both. Perhaps it was because he had a passion for fiddling, dancing, and pleasantry. Finally, he studied law and spoke so well as a lawyer that he soon entered politics. He was elected to the House of Burgesses, which met in Virginia's capital, Williamsburg. And that was where he was when the Stamp Act was passed. He was young, but he stood up and said what he thought. That the Stamp Act was a threat to liberty. Some of the older Virginians cried, "Treason!" because he was attacking the king. To that, Patrick Henry is supposed to have answered, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Some townsfolk and students from the College of William and Mary stood in the doorway of the House of Burgesses and heard that speech. Among them was a young lawyer named Thomas Jefferson. He never forgot it. He said Henry spoke as Homer wrote, and Jefferson thought Homer the greatest of writers. When the English governor of Virginia heard about Patrick Henry's speech, he was furious. He dissolved the House of Burgesses. That means he told the members to go home. But that just made them angry. They walked over to the Raleigh Tavern, where they kept on meeting. And Patrick Henry kept talking. By 1775, 10 years after Henry's Stamp Act speech, it was no longer safe for the Burgesses even to gather in Williamsburg. So they met in a church in Richmond. It was there that Patrick Henry gave his most famous speech. The port of Boston was closed. English soldiers were in the city, and the Massachusetts Assembly had been dissolved. Would Virginia sit idly by? Henry stepped into the aisle, bowed his head, and held out his arms. He pretended his arms were chained as he began calmly. "Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston." His voice strengthened as he said, "The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" Then Patrick Henry threw off the imaginary chains, stood up straight, and cried out, "Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what other course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death." All right. So that's a very famous speech he did. Okay, and he means I either want to be free or life isn't worth living.
Yeah.
All right. So those are the Firebrands. Good night.
Connor.
Okay, you win.